Hi everyone and welcome to a new video. In this video, we're discussing the importance of a resume, especially when you're applying for an international remote offer. What are the things that I did right and what are the things I would like to improve upon if I was applying today? With that, let's get right into the video. So resumes are very important in remote jobs. Most probably when you're applying for a remote job, you're either approaching them on LinkedIn or you're applying on the careers page of that particular company. The resume is the first thing that people look at, and usually that's what will decide whether or not you get the interview. So it's very important to keep a few basic things in mind when you're creating your resume. The first one is keeping it short and sweet. Interviews are usually very busy people. When you're working in a company, you have a lot of tasks to do on a day-to-day basis, and hence scrambling through resumes to find the best talent is a very hard job. No one wants to read through a lot of jargon trying to understand who you are, what you've done in the past. So the best advice here is keep things short and simple. If you look at my resume, every job experience that I have, I've tried to explain everything in less than 3 lines. You have to understand companies work very differently, and it's very hard for someone working in one company to understand the jargon that's happening in a different company. So just keep it very high level. If they have more doubts, they'll clarify it during the interview. The second important point is big names in your resume do help. If you look at my resume, I have Amazon, Goldman Sachs, and 2 Google Summer of Code internships. This might be a little too much, you don't need as much, but if you have at least one big company in your resume, either an internship or a full-time job, it'll definitely help. And I'm not saying these companies are any better than a startup, especially when it comes to your learning curve. But when someone from the US is looking at your resume, if they see a familiar name in there, it makes them a little more comfortable with your resume. So if you have interned at, let's say, Google versus a company like Udaan, which is a great startup, Google might help you a little bit more because the person that's hiring you most probably does not have an idea of what Udaan is. If you look at my resume, most people in the US knew what Goldman Sachs is, and usually good companies also understand open source and open source internships, so GSOC is also a great thing to have in your resume. So if you're currently in college, second year or third year, I think GSOC is the best internship that you can do, and it's right around the corner. The best thing about GSOC is it doesn't matter which college you're from, all that matters is your contributions. You should be able to find a project on it and get right through that door. And that one internship can have snowball effects when you're applying for US based companies. With that, let's transition to the third point, which is open source. So GSOC is one way to get into open source, but there are a lot of companies and organizations out there that don't necessarily participate in GSOC, but their source code is open source. In fact, most of the companies that I work for open source all of their work. So you can always find good open source projects to contribute to. Even if you haven't participated in Google Summer of Code, if you have contributions in good projects, or if you have your own projects that are used by companies all around the world, it's a great sign for someone hiring you for a remote job. Usually when you're working in a remote job, there's a lot of self-accountability. No one's really sitting on your head. You're not really going to an office to get monitored 24/7. And hence a good open source profile will make your interviewer much more comfortable with hiring you. A lot of times, the reason for a remote company to hire from India is to find an expert in a field. And what better way to prove that you're an expert in a field than maintaining or contributing to an open source project in that field? This is probably the most important point here. That's why you'll see throughout my resume, I've mentioned the open source projects that I contribute to or the projects that I've maintained myself. And you'll see my GitHub profile at the very top of my resume. As soon as your resume reaches the hands of a techie, the first thing they look at is a GitHub. And if it's well maintained, they won't even need to look at the rest of your resume. Finally, let's come down to a few things that don't really matter when you're applying. If you look at my resume, at the very end, I've mentioned the college I'm from. It really doesn't matter what college you're from, especially if someone from the US or Europe is hiring you. They usually have no idea what an IIT is, and even if they do, they don't really care too much about college degrees or resumes. A lot of times they hire people who are in college or who haven't even gone to colleges. So this is a section that you can completely remove from your resume. If you want to keep it, feel free to, but it really doesn't matter. Things like what school you went to or what competitions you won in school rarely matter when you're applying for these companies. These companies are looking for a very specific role. They're looking to hire someone who's good in technology, right? Period. That's all they're looking for. So what college you're from doesn't matter. What CGPA you have doesn't matter. Even if you've done a BTech or not, it doesn't matter. As long as you can prove to them you're good at the skills they're hiring you for. Also, one good thing to mention here is that you're open to probationary periods. A lot of times a company might want to hire you, but they'd be slightly uncomfortable because of 1,000 reasons, and you can make them much more comfortable by offering a probationary period. That way, they can test your skills for a month or two. If things work out, it's a win-win situation. If they don't, then they can hire a new talent and you can look for a new job. The amount of opportunity out there is immense. As long as you're good at something, you'll find a job. So the advice here is obvious. Keep things short and sweet. There's no real shortcut to getting a remote job. It's much more different than applying for a FANG job or a traditional tech job, because in these companies, you're expected to join the office and then learn the specific technology you'll be working on. And there's a decent warm-up period, but that won't be the case in a remote job. You'll be expected to hit the ground running as soon as you join. And hence, that's the expectation when they're trying to hire you as well. So the best thing you can do is have a solid open source profile and list all the best projects you have in your resume. Maybe have a stamp from a big tech company just so it makes your interviewer a little more comfortable, and that should be enough to get you that interview. What happens once you enter that interview is a story for another day, but if you'd like to see that video, let me know in the comments. So with that, we're coming close to the end of the video. If you're in college, the most important advice here is to apply for Google Summer of Code. It's right around the corner, so it's probably the best time for you to start contributing to projects. Even if you don't have a GitHub profile right now, it doesn't really matter. You still have a few months to build a good profile and start applying. I have a series from a few years ago where I describe how you can start contributing if you want to apply to Google Summer of Code, and I'll probably be coming out with a more detailed video around that. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.